What if America had never banned alcohol? Picture this. It's New Year's Eve, 1920. Americans across the country are raising their glasses in celebration. Jazz musicians play openly in legitimate clubs, not hidden speakeasies. Al Capone is just another small-time Chicago thug, not the king of a criminal empire. The Roaring Twenties are about to begin, but this time they're roaring without ever going dry. And it all starts with the election of 1920. The Republican candidate, Warren G. Harding, campaigned on a platform of law and order, not prohibition. And he wins in a landslide. Harding's victory leads to the passage of the 18th Amendment, which bans the production and sale of alcohol. But there's no repeal of the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. And as the years go by, America takes a very different path. The Roaring Twenties become a time of great prosperity and economic growth, not just for the rich, but for everyone. The Great Depression never happens, and neither does World War II, and that's why America almost didn't become a dry country. In the 1910s, a coalition of unlikely allies, including the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the powerful Anti-Saloon League, came together to end alcohol consumption in America. They'd been working towards this goal for decades, but they needed one more thing to get it done, and that was World War I. See, the war effort had demonized German-owned breweries. And when the US entered the war in 1917, the temperance movement gained a powerful new weapon. They could now paint alcohol as unpatriotic and use that to finally achieve their goal of a dry America. This wartime boost was just what they needed to push the country over the edge. Without it, the fragile coalition supporting Prohibition would have likely fallen apart. Before we explore our alternate timeline, let's step into the America that Prohibition was supposed to transform. This wasn't a nation of casual drinkers. In the late 1800s, Americans consumed an average of 7 to 12 gallons of alcohol per year, far more than the average today. Saloons weren't just bars, they were the beating heart of working class and immigrant communities. They were places where laborers could meet politicians, where immigrants could find work and community. But this culture had a dark side. Public drunkenness, domestic violence, and alcoholism were serious problems. And the temperance movement wasn't fighting shadows, they were responding to real social issues. The question our alternate timeline poses is whether America could have addressed these problems without the sledgehammer of total prohibition. Could it have limited alcohol consumption to, say, 32 ounces per person per week, enough to keep the social ills at bay, but not enough to fuel the organized crime and widespread corruption that ultimately undermined the experiment? So what prevents prohibition in our timeline? Well, several things. First, imagine if World War I had ended differently, or if anti-German sentiment hadn't been so intense. Without that wartime patriotism to push it over the top, the Temperance Coalition might have lost steam. Second, picture urban wit politicians and immigrant communities organizing more effectively. If the city bosses had recognized the threat to their saloons and breweries sooner, they might have mounted a stronger defense of them. And third, consider the business lobby. Breweries, distilleries, and related industries employed hundreds of thousands of Americans and generated massive tax revenue. In our timeline, these economic interests rally together at the last minute and launch a counter-campaign framing alcohol regulation, not prohibition, as the rational middle ground. The tipping point comes in 1918 when a coalition of urban mayors, immigrant organizations, and business leaders launches the Regulation Not Prohibition campaign. Moderate controls, they argue, can address the social problems associated with alcohol without destroying entire industries. Without prohibition, America's economy takes a dramatically different path. Well, first off, thousands of breweries, distilleries, bars, and other businesses would still be around, providing steady employment and tax revenue that could help the country weather the coming Great Depression. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Milwaukee, which had large German populations, would maintain their brewing industries and the jobs that came with them. And instead of losing hundreds of thousands of jobs overnight, These communities would gradually lose them over the course of several years as the government cracked down on workplace safety programs and alcohol education initiatives. But the real money was in the alcohol taxes. The federal, state, and local governments collected billions of dollars in alcohol taxes that in our timeline disappeared for 13 years. During the Depression, this steady stream of income helped fund public works projects and social programs that might have otherwise been impossible. And perhaps most importantly, organized crime would remain a relatively small-scale problem. While criminal networks did exist before 1920, they never gained the massive profits and power that bootlegging provided. Without Prohibition's black market, these organizations would focus on more traditional crimes like gambling, racketeering, and theft, but never at the scale and influence of the Capone era. What if Al Capone never became a bootlegger? In our timeline, he is a small-time Chicago thug who never builds his criminal empire because he doesn't have the money to do so. Without bootlegging profits, there's no St. Valentine's Day massacre. The Chicago outfit never becomes a national powerhouse. And this has profound implications for law enforcement. The FBI, still in its infancy in the 1920s, focuses its resources on bank robbery, kidnapping, and other federal crimes. The massive expansion of federal crime-fighting powers and wiretapping that occurred during Prohibition develops more slowly and with more oversight. Police forces across America avoided the corruption that plagued the era. Without the enormous profits from bootlegging, criminals couldn't afford to buy off entire police departments. Law enforcement maintains more public trust and legitimacy, which creates a foundation for more effective crime prevention. The justice system also evolves differently. Without thousands of alcohol-related arrests clogging up the courts and prisons, resources are available for other crimes. The prison system doesn't experience the same overcrowding and brutality that it did in our timeline, which could lead to more rehabilitation-focused approaches decades earlier. So what if the 1920s had no prohibition? Would jazz still be born? It turns out that yes, it would. But what about the cultural explosion we associate with the 1920s? How does the jazz age unfold without speakeasies and the thrill of forbidden alcohol? Well, jazz still emerges as America's revolutionary music, but it develops in legitimate clubs rather than hidden speakeasies. And this might actually accelerate its acceptance and mainstream adoption. Without the association with illegal activity, jazz faces less opposition from moral reformers and gains broader social acceptance earlier. The flabber phenomenon, young women asserting their independence through fashion, behavior, and social participation, continues. But perhaps with different symbols. Women's liberation in the 1920s was driven by broader social changes, the right to vote, increased workforce participation, and shifting social norms. These forces existed independently of prohibition, but what about the nightlife? Without the excitement of breaking the law, drinking becomes more normalized and less glamorized. This might lead to more moderate consumption patterns and less binge drinking. And ironically, this could achieve some of the temperance movement's goals through cultural evolution rather than legal prohibition. Did you know that over the decades, our alternate America developed a fundamentally different relationship with alcohol? You see, instead of the dramatic swing from prohibition to repeal, the country experienced a much more gradual and thoughtful approach to regulation. By the 1940s and 50s, America might have developed a more European-style drinking culture, one where alcohol consumption was integrated into daily life rather than being treated as a sinful or rebellious substance. This would have led to lower rates of alcoholism and binge drinking, as well as a much less dramatic rise in the legal drinking age. With alcohol no longer being the forbidden fruit, public health campaigns could have focused on education and moderation rather than abstinence. And with the medical establishment working with continuous data rather than dealing with the disruption of prohibition, we might have developed a much more sophisticated understanding of alcohol's effects on health and society. This more measured approach could have led to more effective and sustainable alcohol policies, including legal drinking ages that were more in line with our European counterparts, less restrictive advertising, and a greater emphasis on public education and responsible consumption. You might think that the effects would be limited to America's borders, but you'd be wrong. Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean would never experience the massive smuggling operations that Prohibition created. The border regions would develop differently. Without the economic boom and violence of rum running, places like Detroit, Cleveland, and Atlanta might look more like their Canadian counterparts, which were more heavily regulated but never went completely dry. Other countries would take notice. Several nations that enacted their own prohibition laws might have reconsidered or never tried it at all. The global temperance movement would also be different. Without the American example, they might have focused more on regulation and education rather than trying to outlaw alcohol entirely. And America's reputation around the world would be very different. We would not have the spectacle of organized crime, widespread law-breaking, and eventual repeal. And so America's moral authority on the world stage might have been much stronger throughout the 20th century. In an alternate history, America does not repeal prohibition. What? Why? And how does this alternate history reveal something profound about American society? Well, join me and find out. In our timeline, the failure and repeal of prohibition highlighted American pragmatism and the limits of legislating morality. But in this alternate history, America never learns this lesson through direct experience. Instead, the country becomes a moralistic theocracy where the federal government enforces a strict code of ethics. This alternate history also shows how economic interests, cultural forces, and political timing can align to create massive social changes, or to prevent them. The businesses, communities, and individuals whose lives were disrupted by prohibition represent not just economic statistics, but human stories of adaptation and resilience. And I want to tell those stories. I want to tell the story of how the American government used the power of the federal government to try and legislate morality and how it failed. And I think that's a story worth telling. What if America had never gone dry? Well, for one thing, there would have been no dramatic rise in organized crime or widespread disrespect for the law. And maybe America's relationship with alcohol wouldn't have been so fraught with unintended consequences. Prohibition ended up being a massive failure, but it almost didn't happen at all. In an alternate timeline, the 18th Amendment is narrowly defeated in Congress. President Woodrow Wilson, who had previously supported women's suffrage, now faces a political crisis. With the women's rights movement in full swing, he can't afford to lose their vote. But with the temperance movement also gaining traction, he needs to tread carefully. In this new timeline, Wilson decides to punt on the issue, leaving it to the states. Over time, a more moderate, sustainable approach to alcohol regulation emerges, one that could have served as a model for addressing other social issues. America might have developed a culture of gradual, evidence-based reform rather than one of dramatic swings between extremes. But we'll never know for sure. What we do know is that the past isn't set in stone. It's a story that could have unfolded in many different ways.